launching, no, profile of the, what was the title? Country profile, yeah, launching of the country profile yesterday. And we have, today also, we have a lot of discussions that will be ongoing. We'll start with agenda item 5, which will be report and discussions on the implementation of regional and international agenda and other special initiatives in the sub-region. Continental Free Trade Area. And then 10:30 to 11 we'll have tea break and coffee, tea. And then 11 to 12 we have agenda item 5B, which will be panel discussion on the private sector and the blue economy, production, investment and accelerated economic growth, poverty reduction and development. Then from noon to 13 hours, we have agenda item 5C, where there will be another panel discussion on the role of landlocked and land-linked countries in the blue economy. Then it will be followed by lunch break. After lunch break, at 14 hours to 15:30, we'll meet again. We'll have agenda item 5D, where there will be panel discussion on strengthening collaboration in the blue economy sector among coastal countries. Then we'll have a short tea and coffee break, and we'll take up again at 17:30 to 20 hours, where there will be high-level ministerial roundtable, which will be, there will be moderator, Honorable Marie-José Etienne Sinatombu, Minister of Social Security, National Solidarity and Environment and Sustainable Development. Then there will be, along with the moderator, will be Honorable Prem Kunju, Minister of Ocean Economy, who was among us yesterday. There will be Honorable, what we call Mr. Jean-Richard Payendi, Commissioner for Environment, Forestry, Tourism, Marine Park and Fisheries, Rodrigue Regional Assembly. Then Ambassador Sanfi Ismail from Comoros. And then at 19 hours to 20 hours, there will be cocktail hosted by the government of Mauritius. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with agenda item 5A, which will be a report and discussion on the implementation of regional and international agenda and other special initiatives in the sub-region, progress status of the Continental Free Trade Area. I invite... Yes, sir. Can take the floor, please. Okay, good.
Good morning, distinguished colleagues and friends. Our apologies for the late start. We had a technical problem in getting the presentation loaded. It's a great honor and privilege for me. My name is David Luke, the coordinator of ECA's African Trade Policy Center based in Addis Ababa. So it's a great honor and privilege for me to make this presentation on the progress and status of the continental free trade area. I'm going to take you through the rationale for the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, as we say for short. So I'll take you through the rationale. I'll give you an update on the negotiations where we are at this present time. I am very much aware that my audience here includes distinguished colleagues from ministries of finance, planning, economy, etc. So we've tried to include in the presentation some of our ideas as this can affect the fiscal space, how this trade agreement can affect the fiscal space and the policy space that development planners and other experts could have in the policy-making process. Then I'll say something about trade policy coherence to underscore why this agreement is so important for Africa. And then finally, I'll say something on our thinking as regards the kinds of national strategies that each country should have in order to benefit from this agreement. So let me start then with the rationale. What we're trying to show on this slide is that when you compare India and Africa, there are two very similar entities. Of course, India is one country, whereas Africa is divided into 54. And with 54 countries also, Africa has 107 borders, land borders. But in terms of GDP, and in terms of several other economic metrics, the two entities are very similar. But India is able to conduct its trade policy as one entity, whereas the African countries, because they're divided into 54 entities, struggle with trade policy coherence. So this is an issue I'll come back to. But the advantages for India means that they could attract investment in a way that investors are certain of one market, whereas in Africa with the fragmentation, that's the opposite case. So India can enjoy economies of scale, economies of scope, which is not the case in the African market. Also keep in mind that as I'm comparing the two entities, the two biggest African economies are only a fraction of other major economies. For example, the Nigerian economy is about 2% of the EU 28. The South African economy is about 3% of the EU 28. So these economies of scale, scope, at a time when Africa should be benefiting from the growth we have seen and from its increasing population size and the growth of its middle class. So if you look at the next slide, the rationale then of having a trade agreement that tries to consolidate the African economic space is that first benefit is that it creates one African market. It facilitates economies of scale and scope, and also facilitates regional value chains. It allows African businesses to gain from Africa's good market dynamics. Of course, Africa is a poor continent, no question about that, but its GDP is growing and it's quite significant. And as I said, the population base as well. Another rationale is that, as we all know, most African countries are dependent on exports, which are mainly extractives. Most African countries are dependent on exports, which are mainly extractives. These have been shown. Again, I don't need to go too much into this. It's a story you're all very familiar with, that the price volatility, the limited impact on employment, fluctuating revenues are all difficulties which African countries have had to contend with. Yeah. But when you look at what is happening with intra-African trade, whereas the largest share of Africa's exports are extractives, commodities, what we find that with intra-African trade, only about 40% is extractives, that is intra-African exports, what African countries export to each other. And behind these exports, they are mainly labor-intensive products, which of course have an impact on the job situation. And if we're talking about the transformation of African economies, then clearly that is the direction in which to go. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about food, I'm talking about pharmaceuticals, I'm talking about items of clothing, toiletries, everyday items which are being produced and exported by African countries to one another. Clearly that is, if you like, a much more sophisticated form of trade and a much higher value form of trade. So pulling all this together, and based on the analysis we have done at ECA, including modeling work, what we project is that all African countries will gain from having a continent-wide free trade area agreement. Of course, the more industrialized countries will gain more than others because they're well and better placed given that they do have manufactured products. But for all countries, there's a possibility of engaging in regional value chains, which can help their suppliers to be part of continent-wide and global value chains. The agreement also is a major opportunity for Africa to satisfy its food security requirements. Currently, the continent imports about 60 billion worth of food, and the case can easily be made that much of that could be substituted through Africa's own production if the trading conditions are right. The agreement also facilitates diversification of exports for resource-rich countries. As we've said, the huge dependence on natural resources. Then also we find that even landlocked African countries gain from improved trade facilitation because they are I think So as I was saying, there are gains. What we estimate is gains for all categories of African countries. The more industrialized, of course, better placed, but other countries that are not so industrialized can be part of regional and global value chains. Opportunities for satisfying the food security requirements, diversification of exports for the resource-rich countries. Landlocked countries gain from better cooperation at the border. And then for those countries that fear being inundated by exports, there are also provisions in the agreements for safeguards for, in the case of import surges and so on. So in short, what I'm saying here is that we see this agreement as a win-win for all African countries, and indeed this is what the research and analysis shows. Now, I want to move from the rationale of the agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, to say something now about where we are in regard to the implementation of the agreement, in regard to the negotiations, where we are, and so on. And I'm showing this map, which shows that as of now, 49 of the 54 African countries have actually signed the agreement. So far, 7 countries have ratified it, and you can see from the color code those that have signed, those that have ratified, etc. There are 3 more countries that have committed to sign and implement the agreement, and they did this through what is known as the Kigali Declaration. As you know, the agreement was signed at a ceremony in Kigali in March this year. And there are 3 countries that are as yet to commit. And these 3 are Nigeria, Guinea-Bissau, and Eritrea. So out of all the countries, only these 3. But of these 3, there are signs that as soon as political processes allow, they also want to get on board. And in particular, as regards Nigeria, it should be said that it was Nigeria that chaired the last 2 trade negotiating rounds of that led to the agreement. So clearly, Nigeria is very much on board, but there have been political difficulties which they're working on, and the expectation is that Nigeria, as Africa's biggest economy, will also get on board. I know much has been made in the press about Nigeria not signing at the Kigali ceremony, but I think we should understand this in terms of the dynamics of trade agreements, which sometimes have some strong political sensitive aspects. The next steps going forward is that the African Union Commission, which of course is behind the whole process leading to the agreement, has a roadmap which it expects by January 2019 that all the countries involved would have prepared schedules of concessions and trading goods, because what was agreed is that there will be 90% liberalization of tariff lines. This means that the countries need to indicate for the remaining 10% how they're going to liberalize those tariff lines, what would be excluded products within the 10%, what would be sensitive products within the 10%, and so on. Then each country also has to prepare its concessions for trading services, and then the negotiators are still working on product-specific rules of origin. The agreement will enter into force when the 22 instruments of ratification deposited with the African Union Commission, as we showed in the map, 7 have so far ratified. We are seeing a growing momentum and dynamism as businesses are beginning to look to see how they can benefit from this agreement. We see a lot of interest from around the world in this effort that Africa is making to consolidate its market, and the African Union Commission is projecting that by March next year, which will be the first anniversary of the agreement, that the 22 ratifications would be in place. Let me also say that each country has a different process when it comes to ratifications. Some countries require the cabinet to agree, and that's essentially the ratification process. Other countries require the legislature, the national legislature, to agree. So there are different processes that countries follow according to their constitutional requirements. But the expectation is that the 22 ratifications will be in place by next March. Aside from the 7, we know that there are 12 ratification processes that are quite active at the moment in various other countries. So the projection by the African Union Commission to have the 22 by March, I think, is viable. We have started working with the African Union Commission to prepare for the phase 2 of the negotiations, because what has been completed is, as I'll come back to this, is agreement on trading goods and services. And then phase 2 would include investment, competition policy, intellectual property rights. As I said before, I wanted to include some remarks in this presentation that would be of interest, especially to planners, to policymakers in finance ministries, ministries of the economy, and so on. One of the issues that has often arisen is what would be the implications of moving towards a free trade area for revenue that comes from tariffs. And here we've also done some work at TCA, and this is what I'd like to present to you. Firstly, because the level of inter-African trade is relatively small, we expect the impact also to be small. And the whole rationale of the free trade area is to grow trade between the African countries. But then also what we found is that even this small level, that about 56% of inter-African imports already enjoy duty-free access through the existing REX free trade area agreement. So especially in relation to this group, the SADC FTA has already liberalized trade within the SADC countries. So in that subset of African countries, obviously the point is that there wouldn't be much further impact. Then also, as I mentioned, there is a provision for exclusion list, an exclusion list, which could be theoretically up to 9%, because keep in mind I said that 10% is reserved for sensitive products and exclusion lists. So the expectation is that each country in its implementation of the agreement and its schedule of concessions would indicate what is to be excluded, up to 9%, and what is sensitive, maximum 1% if 9% is excluded. Also, the agreement has provisions for gradual implementation, 15 years for the least developed countries among the African countries. Again, among the SADC countries, this is something that Lesotho and I guess Mozambique, this is a provision that would apply to them. And then for sensitive products, there's also more gradual liberalization, 10 to 13 years. And then, as I said, the revenue impact we expect to be quite small because import trade taxes on intra-African trade is only about 15% of total revenue in Africa. So the tariff reductions, in our estimation, will only affect a small share of tax generation. But on the other hand, obviously, the expected impact of the agreement on African economies, what we expect to see is, in fact, the tax base to grow. And this is the point that is made in this next slide. So insofar as we are projecting that the agreement, when fully implemented, could affect economic growth by anything from 1 to 6% of GDP, it does mean that there will be an increased border tax base and boost revenue collection. And we are even saying that the overall effect, the economic boost could be even higher because we have not included services and investment in the modeling work. The sectors that gain most are those that can generate economic transformation, sustainable growth, that is manufacturing and processed agriculture. And these then would be able to contribute to fiscal sustainability in a much more dynamic and comprehensive way. So this is our projection in terms of how we see the agreement affecting the macro policy framework in African countries. Now let me shift to say something about why this agreement is also important for Africa. I've already talked about the rationale, where we are in terms of the negotiations, the move towards implementing the agreement, the effect on the fiscal space, and now to say something about the importance of this agreement in a changing world. Many of us who work on trade used to lament that nobody takes any notice of us, that we work in our little area, and aside from specialists, no one really knows what is happening on trade. But thanks perhaps to the current incumbent at the White House, now you can almost never listen to any news bulletin or read the newspapers without having something on trade. Basically, what we are seeing is that we're entering in. What we're seeing is that we're entering into what could be described as a very dangerous world. Dangerous in the sense that trade needs predictable rules. That's why you have trade agreements. That's why the African countries are coming together to establish what will be the rules for trading across the continent, as they have done in the REX, but now to look at what would be the rules for trading right across the continent. And globally, that's why the WTO, before it the GATT, was an important pillar of the international system, because that's where the agreements on how countries trade with one another were established, and there's predictability, and everybody understands exactly how they would trade with one another. This gives businesses, investors, the confidence, the certainty that the established rules for trading across the world. And if there are problems, the ways of settling disputes, again, established procedures for dispute settlement, etc. So that is the world that we knew, that was predictable, and that had this certainty as to how trade is to be conducted. But what we are seeing today is that much of this certainty is being thrown out as countries are moving firstly to consolidate trade on a regional basis, to look to see how they can maximize advantage on a regional basis, and then globally to move away from the established role of the WTO. So what we're going to show in this map is that you have these mega regional trade agreements, which are basically carving up the world. In North America, of course, you have the NAFTA, which itself is undergoing its own challenges. In Europe, of course, you have the European Union. In Southeast Asia, moves to negotiate a regional comprehensive economic partnership, and then linking the countries of the Pacific with the countries of the Pacific in the Americas with those in Asia has been the effort to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then also there was an effort between the European Union and the United States to negotiate a Trans-Atlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But basically what you're seeing is this kind of regionalization of trade. At the same time, the world economy has changed significantly with the rise of the emerging market economies, preeminently China with its own challenges and its own dynamics. What has not changed in Africa outside of the efforts of the REX in almost 70 years of independence is that we have, on this continent, have been trading more or less in the same way that we have at the time of independence. So in almost 70 years, we've not really looked critically at how we trade on this continent as a continent. Of course, we have done that. We've made much progress within the REX, but we've not looked at the continent-wide advantages that we could achieve. And keep in mind what I said earlier about the scale of African economies, the size of African economies, which are relatively small, with the whole of Africa about the size of, say, the Belgian economy. In this kind of context, then obviously there are gains to be made by consolidating the African market by having clear, predictable rules for trading on the African continent. And this is what this slide is showing, that by consolidating the African market, the African countries are in a stronger position for negotiating with others around the world. This is a continent of 1.2 billion people. And it's also clear that the way that we used to trade is changing. Whereas a number of African countries had preferential market access, say, for example, to the United States under AGOA. The US has already signaled that when that arrangement comes to an end in 2025, it wants to look at a much more reciprocal trading arrangement with Africa. With the European Union, the effort to negotiate economic partnership agreements have not worked, again, outside of the SADC region, which is the only region that was successfully able to conclude a partnership agreement with the European Union. That has not worked, and Africa is now looking at a continent-wide agreement with Europe. And then with emerging economies, there's virtually nothing in place. We are aware that Mauritius is trying to negotiate an agreement with China and looking at that with great interest. But basically with the emerging economies, there's no framework as such. And keep in mind that you can no longer fall back on the WTO, because even at the WTO, we've seen these issues arise, which is undermining its own credibility, and the fact that the Doha round, which was launched in 2001, 17 years ago, has up to now not been concluded. The thinking now is that Africa needs to consolidate its own market, which will give it some coherence, policy coherence, in terms of how it engages with other partners. Even at the WTO, having a unified African approach would mean that the African countries have a stronger and more effective voice at the WTO. Also, we're saying that having this continent-wide agreement can help to protect and consolidate what has also been achieved at the regional level, given the problems that have been encountered by regions such as ECOWAS, ECAS, in trying to negotiate with the European Union, for example. So, in short, trade policy coherence would mean that the African market is secured, and given this current uncertainty, these sort of dangerous times that we now live in, and also given that in any event, whatever preferences Africa had in some of these developed country markets are being eroded, that this is the time to consolidate and to have a much more coherent approach to trade policy. Now, I'd like to move to the final part of the presentation, which is to say something about how countries can benefit from the AFCFTA. Keep in mind what I said earlier, that our modeling work shows that all countries would benefit, although it's also true to say that the modeling shows that those countries that have a substantial manufacturing base already would benefit even more. But we ECA are currently looking at how we could work with member states to develop their own national strategies for benefiting from the AFCFTA. And in particular, I'd like to say here this morning that we're looking at basically the countries that want us to work with them, that we're looking at responding very quickly to this, because we are putting a lot of emphasis on the effective implementation of the agreement. So with the permission of the director here, I'd just like to say that we are receiving requests, and we continue to be quite open to any member state that wants us to work with them. We are mobilizing resources to be able to do this effectively. So basically what we expect to do is that we're saying that countries have to undertake deliberate actions and deploy the necessary efforts through effective and integrated national strategies to maximize the benefits of the agreement while minimizing the potential risks. At our Conference of Ministers that was held in May 2018, the conference actually called for AFCFTA national strategies, and this would require the countries to identify where the intra-African comparative advantages lie, and then to design and implement the necessary actions to harness these advantages. Also, it means that by doing this, countries would have a better picture of what kind of adjustment costs they have to face. I did argue earlier that we expect the overall liberalization effect on the fiscal space to be minimal, but nonetheless, minimal does not mean zero. So it does mean that there would be need for adjustment. And as I just said, about a dozen countries working with us on these national strategies, and we remain open to work with as many countries as possible. This is something that we are prioritizing at ECA. And what will the national strategies entail? Firstly, on the production and trade part, it will require situational analysis to review the production and trade profile, to get into a deeper analysis of intra-African and global trade performance, then to identify opportunity sectors through statistical analysis of market opportunities, value chains, and scope of value addition. Let me underscore here that increasingly the way that investors are approaching production is not necessarily to produce the product in just one place. It might be to produce a component of the product, and so value chains have become very important, which is good for, especially for small African economies, which can then produce components that manufactured or assembled elsewhere. Already in Southern Africa, we've done studies which show, for example, the automobile industry, that much of this is happening through components being produced in other countries that are destined for South Africa. And in identifying opportunity sectors, also to assess comparative advantage, trade costs, market concentration, specialization, etc., in order to position the country, the sectors that are being prioritized, the products, in a much more dynamic way. And then also to identify critical bottlenecks, the constraints, non-tariff barriers, trade information, trade finance, etc., the production investment challenges, and in short, to have a plan to benefit from this agreement. We are clear that the benefits will not flow automatically, that there has to be some effort at the national level to look in a strategic way how to benefit from the agreement. So we also see then these strategic actions that would then boost the priority sectors, the actions required to target the identified constraints, the complementary initiatives for attracting investment. Then also to look at the risks involved in this implementing the agreement, because all trade agreements have risks. We cannot accurately predict, even through modeling, exactly what would happen. In fact, modeling only gives you a broad idea of the landing zone, but doesn't tell you how things may turn out in practice. So it's important to identify the risks through increased competition, the fiscal impact, and to ensure monitoring, preparedness for taking action, such as trade remedies if countries feel that the markets are being inundated, safeguards, the exceptions, how they'll be applied, and so on. And this requires, of course, a results-based approach to monitor, to see how things are working out over time. Also, the final point has to do with financing the strategy. We are suggesting that low-cost, quick-win interventions obviously should be prioritized. Scope to identify mechanisms for mobilizing domestic and financial and international financial resources. And here, let me also underscore that a number of partners have come forward to say that they are interested in working with African countries as they implement these agreements. We are aware, for example, that the Germans, through the G20 Compact for Africa, are actually looking for countries that want to enter into a compact for these, for the types of investments and to support the reforms. We recently at ECA made the case to the Germans to include implementation of the AFCFTA as one of the criteria that they should be looking at. So, Chair, I've come to the end of my presentation. And I'd just like to thank the audience for listening to me. I could see much interest in what I'm saying, notes being taken, and of course this presentation will be made available through the organizers. If there's time for questions, I'll be delighted to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. David Luke, for this interesting expose on the progress and status of the Continental Free Trade Area. We have some 30 minutes. We'll now open the floor for discussion, and after that, we'll have the tea and coffee break. The floor is now open to everybody. Let us start with Komesa over there first. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Doc for this very informative presentation. I have very, very few comments. There are three, very short. The first one is that it's a question. when we are consolidating the African market through the continental free trade area, I think we need also to look at the trading arrangement that some selected African countries have already concluded with the rest of the world. And this includes China, EU, India, US. So you find some selected countries having bilateral trade arrangement. So when we negotiate, when we consolidate the continental market, we should also think about the means to terminate those bilateral trade agreements if we need to protect this market and have the same standard. Otherwise, we will have a lot of trading arrangement within the continent, and it will even affect the outcome of this consolidated market we need to come up with. The second comment I wanted to make is that we need also to anticipate our future trading arrangement with other economic blocs. The EU has stated, I think 1 week ago, that now they want to negotiate the trade agreement with the continent, the African continent, and not individual countries. So already the EU is thinking about what type of a provision to come up with for that negotiation. We don't know when it will start, but the EU has already have this in mind. So I will suggest that when, before even the second phase of the negotiation started, we should always have, when negotiating, we should have in mind that we need to consolidate this market when we negotiate with other economic blocs. Otherwise, they will come, fragment again this market, and make sure that it will be their own products that will benefit from the consolidated African market. So we should prepare our position a bit earlier. The third and the last one I wanted to work on is that with regard to the second phase on cross-border investment, since 2012, the African Union has put in place a committee of investment experts within the continent. So we worked during 3 years, negotiation on negotiation. And we came up with a continental framework with a set of provision that looked at Africa first in terms of sustainable development goal, in terms of industrial development, because if we need to trade with the rest of the world, we need to have goods, the processed good, so that we can really be a partner. In this framework, investment framework, we have also set the principles on the balance between the right obligation of investors and the host country. And this to avoid what is happening today in terms of international arbitration claims initiated by OECD investors against the African countries, but developing countries in general. We know what South Africa faced in terms of claims at ICSID. We know what Egypt faced, Kenya, and other countries. So in that framework, there are provisions that consolidate our own interests, African interests. And I think it should be the basis of the chapter on investment within the continental free trade area. Otherwise, the OECD countries, because they have the position, they will come again and perpetuate what we have been facing up to now. So these are my few comments on the next phase of the continental free trade area. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. David, look, you
thank you very much, dear colleague from COMESA, for these comments. On the last issue, negotiating the phase 2, let me assure you that actually this is exactly the approach that the AU is planning to take. The work that has been done on the African Investment Charter will form the basis of the agreement, and as you rightly point out, one of the issues that was looked at in the preparation of this charter is what would work for Africa as regards investor-state disputes. And the thinking is that the investment protocol of the AFCFTA would indeed make provisions for state-to-state engagement when it comes to disputes, not investors taking a state to arbitration, as you say. And this, of course, is also inspired by the SADC protocol on investment, which is regarded as best practice. I think you alluded to South Africa in this regard. However, within that, there is also provision for dealing with, if you like, minor annoyances that investors may have that are legitimate, such as, for example, an investor may say that they were promised that they could bring up to 20 executives into the country to oversee their investment, but they're having visa issues, etc. So those sorts of minor issues really can be sorted out at the level of the state, the investor arbitration or whatever processes. But major issues would be sorted out on a state-to-state basis. That is the investor, where the home origin of the investment needs to go through its official channels to engage with African countries and African governments, and not have investors dragging African governments into arbitration and into other dispute areas. So I think these issues that you're raising have been thought through very carefully. I would also add that when it comes to competition policy, issues of market dominance, which we're seeing especially in the digital sector, that by having a consolidated market, you're in a better position to discipline market dominance. We're seeing this, for example, in Europe, where big companies like Google are being taken on by through the European competition policy arrangements. On the African side, you do need to have that kind of power, which only comes through consolidation to be able to deal with market governance. And the same for intellectual property, where already there is a blueprint at the AU for rationalizing the fragmented approach that African countries have taken in the past towards protecting intellectual property. As you're aware, there are two major IP organizations on the continent, each going in a separate direction. So hopefully this new protocol will find a bridge to bring the two together so we could have a consolidated intellectual property regime on this continent. There are many challenges that we are seeing. African products being patented outside of the continent, African innovations being taken over because we lack an adequate policy framework. Then very quickly on your second point about the signals from the EU through President Juncker's statement last week to the European Parliament. Indeed, now that Africa is looking at negotiating a post-Cotonou agreement with the EU, trade is expected to be an important part of this. This trade policy coherence is one that is very much on the agenda. I'm aware that the Executive Council of the African Union met last Friday in Addis, where they were looking at these issues, which I believe would go back to the summit for a final decision on how to approach the European Union. But clearly, we are getting these signals from partners that they want to engage with Africa as a continent, again, to avoid all these issues that have been there in the past, the EPAs, the fragmentation, the uneasiness among several African negotiating configurations about negotiating in the way that the EPAs were being designed. And then finally, your point about the bilateral agreements, these will automatically be disciplined through the MFN, or the Most Favored Nation clause, that is already in the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. In other words, when countries sign this agreement, they were also signing to a provision within the agreement that says that an African country cannot offer much more favorable terms to a third party than it has offered to other African countries within the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So that should help to discipline the bilateral agreements. And what we are seeing actually is because the African economies are so small, many of these bilateral agreements are not really in their favor. And this is one reason we've been looking at the Mauritius-China negotiations with great interest, just given the disparity between the two economies. So let me stop here, but thank you for these questions. I think they come to the heart of some of the issues that Africa needs to grapple with at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravind. We have from our friend from SADC who want to intervene.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, just want to touch on one small aspect, which really is, I do know that what has been mentioned about these fragmented approaches is correct. However, we also need to take advantage of what is in existence at the moment because of the one concept, the fungibility of money. Money has no color. At the moment, some facilities we have, I think as member states, we need to take advantage. For instance, I'll just pick one example. There are many examples. I think the presenter who did a very good job has already alluded to what we need to do about certain aspects, EPAs and so on and so forth. From the SADC perspective, I think, for example, we have the TRF, which was launched in August 2017 on our member states. I do think that we need to take advantage because the improvement of our competitiveness through these facilities obviously will impact positively regardless of probably the source of the money. For instance, the TRF is, as we know, is a mechanism for financial and technical support for SADC member states to assist them in implementing commitments made under two windows. The member states' participation in the SADC FTA and what has been alluded to, the EPA arrangement. For instance, the funds which have been made available in our member states, which I think for now, we are talking about 32 million signed in 2014, for implementation over 5 years, we really need to take advantage because this will help us improve participation of our member states in order to contribute to sustainable development. For example, under these windows I've mentioned, so far, I think there's a lot happening and our member states are implementing a number of things. In 2017 alone, under that window, number one, which is FTA arrangement, $16.8 million from EU and $6 million to implement various activities. The reason why I mention this is because money has no color. The principle of fungibility of money is, I think, a proven fact. We need to take advantage because these funds, which are being channeled through our member states, even from EU and so on and so forth, are funds which we can use to improve our areas. Because these funds, for instance, they are funds which are sitting in the customs cooperation area, technical barriers to trade, sanitary measures, rules of origin, trade facilitation. All these are issues which are very, very relevant, and importantly for SADC, industrial development and trade promotion. Lastly, let me just mention that in terms of allocation, which I still insist that we should take advantage of, and I'm glad that the well-made presentation touched on this. Out of these funds, the majority of them actually touch on industrial development, which is 21%, and 18% on technical barriers to trade. So in other words, we need to take advantage of facilities, funds, regardless of source, but of course, bearing in mind what my colleague from COMESA did mention. I thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Our friend from SADC. Yes, Doc.
Yes, thank you, Chair. No, I fully agree with a colleague from SADC. In disciplining trade policy and agreements with third parties, it does not mean that that should affect development cooperation. I did mention, for example, the Germans and how they want to support implementation of the FCFTA. And also what we have observed is that even the effort to negotiate the EPAs with the EU over a long period of time, I believe, over 12 years, those negotiations were ongoing, helped to build the capacity of African negotiators such that when they sat down to negotiate the AFCFTA, a lot of capacity had been built through the engagement with Europe, which was a positive thing. So no, I fully agree with you that we should be looking at where we could get investment, where we could get technical assistance, where we could get development assistance grants, irrespective of the source. But that does not mean, of course, that we do not consolidate our market. We do not try to take full advantage of our own market. But I think we're all on the same page on the issues you raised.
Any further views, comments, or suggestions, please? Yeah. Yes. Yes, kindly introduce yourself, please. Yeah.
Chair, my name is Davis Kaluba from Pulungu in Zambia. My question is on the issue of immigration. As we consolidate, my view is that the European Union, for example, is looking at trade with Africa through the lenses of immigration. Do we have appropriate response strategies? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Indeed, I think the EU, as they look at trade investment with Africa, also have this immigration aspect very much as a challenge that they feel that they have to face, given recent trends. And indeed, I think we have to ask ourselves, why would young Africans want to leave this continent? They leave because of the opportunities. And as I said earlier, trade policy has not changed in 70 years of independence. We have been exporting commodities which we know do not generate jobs, little value added, lost opportunities. And so we've had all these issues regarding immigration and so on. So clearly the EU is looking at all of these issues in a holistic way. But I think on the African side, I think the African policymakers, to their credit, are also looking at how to respond to the challenges, the population growth, the youth bulge, the employment issues, and clearly, whilst trade is not the answer to everything, it's certainly a big part of the answer, which is why we are seeing this effort to consolidate the market. Then within Africa also, as you know, accompanying the Free Trade Area Agreement provisions to ease the movement of Africans within the continent, which has its own benefits as well, that you not only liberalize goods, but also you liberalize movement of people in a way that could make it possible for economic operators to take advantage of the agreement. So in Kigali, at the same time that the AFCFTA was being signed, the protocol on free movement was being signed. Let me just underscore that this protocol has disciplines. For example, an African can move to another African that is a member, another African country that is a member of the protocol for 90 days. During those 90 days to establish what is the economic arrangements that this person who has moved would be engaged in. So there are disciplines that accompany this. But clearly it's a step in the right direction. But yes, the Europeans have this in mind. Although the immigration into Europe from Africa is minimal, there is much more immigration or migration, if you like, within Africa than is between African countries and the EU. But nonetheless, it's an important challenge given the risks and given all the other issues that we all know so well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Luke. Yeah, we now invite our colleague from Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to thank the presenter for that lucid presentation on the AFCTA. But I just wanted to find out from him whether the challenge for us that is limiting trade amongst African countries is really an issue of tariffs. It would appear to me that maybe that's not really the major challenge. Yes, if we reduce tariffs, even if we cut them to zero for most of the products, it will improve trade. But by how much? It would appear to me that the challenge that we have is that we do not have products which are beneficiated. And hence, most of our exports go elsewhere because most of our products that we produce are primary, of a primary nature. And then we import those which are beneficiated from those people that we export to. In my view, I think as we try to enhance trade amongst ourselves, I think we need to put more rigor on cooperation in the areas of research, in the areas of technology, in the areas of beneficiating our own products, so that those primary products are exchanged amongst ourselves, or they are beneficiated within our borders. And I think that it will enhance trade amongst ourselves. But as it is now, we can have the free trade area for Africa, but there may not be much in the form of increased trade amongst ourselves. I would like to echo what the Honorable Minister of Mauritius for Foreign Affairs said yesterday. I think we need to be more rigorous in the manner in which we do our things. We need to see ourselves less as victims and be more aggressive. The way I see our approach now is we're just creating a free trade area because it's best practice, but we are not aggressive even when we approach other markets and other regions, even in the area of trade. Thank you very much.
Yes, no.
Thank you, dear colleague from Zimbabwe, for these comments. Let me just say a few things. Firstly, yes, it's true that bringing down tariff is not the full story. Much more needs to be done. But even bringing down tariffs, what our studies have shown is that bringing down the tariffs to 0% can boost inter-African trade by 50%. And here we are talking about a boost of $35 billion. The other aspect is that although the trade is small, which I pointed out, it has grown from roughly 12% about 2011 to 18% 2017, but about 46% of the intra-African trade, intra-African exports to be precise, is value-added products, compared with 80% of the exports outside of the continent being commodities. So bringing down the tariffs, and by the way, average tariffs in Africa is about 6.8%. When Africa exports outside of the continent, average tariff is 2%. So even bringing down the tariffs would have an impact, but you're quite right, other things need to be done. And this is why when the AU summit decided to negotiate FTA in 2012, they also launched what they call the Boosting Intra-African Trade Initiative. And that initiative has 7 pillars. You mentioned technology and all these things. Those are under the production capacity pillar. Then they also talked about trade facilitation. They talked about trade information, better trade information systems. They talked about trade-related infrastructure. They talked about several others, as I said, 7 pillars altogether. And much progress is being made in each of these pillars. And by the way, we carefully document this at TCA. We have a publication which is known as the Assessing Regional Integration in Africa. The 9th edition is about to come out in January next year. But if you look at the back issues, we have been carefully monitoring and reporting on what progress is being made in integrating the continent, on infrastructure, on even trade, what is going on, non-tariff barriers, etc. So yes, all of these areas need to be worked on. We need also to have best practice on trade, which, as I said, we've not had trade reforms in almost 70 years of independence continent-wide. But we need to work in all of these areas. My sense is that I have been working in this area for more than 25 years. I've not seen ever the level of interest in trade policy that I find among African policymakers today than in the past. Even, the case of Zimbabwe, we had a meeting of 7 countries that are looking at starting the liberalization process below 90%. And we had some discussions with the Zimbabwean delegation just a couple of days ago. And clearly, the current government, trade and investment is the central pillars of how they see the Zimbabwean economy going into the future. And everything I heard from the officials who were there is that there's much determination and much vigor behind this strategy. So I think, as you rightly quoted the minister from Mauritius saying that these initiatives need to be pursued with vigorousness and not to sit back and see ourselves as victims. I think this mindset clearly has changed, just given the emphasis that virtually all African countries are putting on trade and investment in this current time. So I think I agree with you, and I also agree with you that we need to do much more than just liberalize tariffs. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. David Luke. Let's give applause to all the participants here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached almost for the morning session. We are now breaking for tea break. You will have to be present here at 11 sharp, and the next agenda for this session will be a panel discussion on the private sector and the blue economy, production, investment, and accelerated economic growth, poverty reduction and development. And the moderator will be Mrs. Laibu Setu from SABC, South Africa. Okay, then let's break for tea and coffee, and then we'll come back at 11 sharp. Thank you very much.